This is a documentary that examines Israeli war crimes against Palestinian civilians through the lens of three families in Gaza, and of course also looks at the U.S.'s role in this conflict. Sharif and Kavitha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Kavitha, I want to start with you as the director of this film, because I've said before on this show that the experience of witnessing this war, and to call it a war sticks in my throat, it really doesn't do justice to what we've been seeing over the last 9 months. But like, it has, if you wake up every day and look at your phone and see images of unspeakable human suffering and cruelty, even if, no matter what you feel about it, I think human beings have like a natural defense mechanism against it, where you become numb to it, and after a while it just seems it can become commonplace. It just becomes a kind of kaleidoscope of horror. Kavitha, for you, as the director of this movie, how do you feel about what this movie does is that in examining these three families, it takes them out of like your cell phone screen or an immediate video, and it gives images and voice to Palestinians in Gaza that sort of like through film breaks out of the cell phone camera documentary footage. Could you talk about why you think that's important, and also just the practicality of producing this film, obtaining these interviews, and obtaining the footage that you have in this film?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that we couldn't have done any of this without these amazing journalists and filmmakers in Gaza who did the filming and a lot of the reporting as well. And we're just really honored that we were able to work with them on this. And yeah, I think there is this risk that people kind of in doom scrolling, that they'll just get numb to to what we're seeing. And I think that was kind of one of the goals, even with when we were approaching it, it's a massive task to figure out, well, how are we going to do this? And within Jazeera, there's obviously Jazeera is covering what's happening in Gaza completely 24 hours a day. But for us, our kind of job within the network is to look at the US role in a story, which obviously in this case is incredibly clear. And so one of the things we wanted to, was kind of picking essentially parts of this war and families that have experienced those specific things to show tracing them alongside the Biden response. So one of those obviously was the massive bombing campaign. So we wanted to have, focus on one airstrike and how it happened and what it did to that family. And then the next part of it was, going through the war was when, the quote unquote safe zones, such a ridiculous term, when those happened, and the fact that those safe zones were then and continue to still be attacked. And so that was the Al Ghaff family in Han Yunis. And then the next part of it was, when we were really starting to kind of figure out how we were going to do this film, one of the things, in December is when we started to get a lot of the allegations about extrajudicial or summary executions, right, by ground troops, because the ground troops by that point had a really firm hold of the north. And so we decided that we wanted to investigate a ground attack, if at all possible. So we kind of had those three things as what we were going to do. And as we were working on it, the attack on Hind Rajab and her family happened, and we decided that we had to include that as well. And in terms of working with the journalists, the way we coordinated it was a lot of it was difficult. I mean, because they don't have, even on the ground with each other and with the interviewees that they were filming, they don't have steady cell phone access. And a lot of times, a lot of the interviewees didn't have cell phone access. So the team on the ground, they couldn't just call Hind Rajab's mother, Wissam, to say, hey, can we come meet you tomorrow? They actually had to go walk to her place. It took a couple of hours, and go ask her if she, one, would do the interview, and two, when she could do it. And they filmed with her twice, actually. So even just like those logistics were a huge part of it. And, the other part of it, it's in terms of sending the footage, that probably sounds like it's a small thing, but it's not. They had to, getting internet access isn't steady, and even getting to a place where you could connect to the internet meant going up high. And so, which wasn't always safe. So yeah, it was kind of for them, a massive undertaking. And they did, that's what all these journalists in Gaza are having to do, just to show everyone what's happening.
Kavitha, I saw an interview with you did on Democracy Now, where you talked about how your colleagues in Gaza had to like go to rooftops to get signal to upload this footage. And this is in the context of something that the movie discusses quite a bit, which is the use of quadcopters that are just these roaming sniper drones that just seemingly shoot anyone that they find on the street. So, I mean, it's really not an exaggeration to say that your Palestinian colleagues in Gaza risk their lives, and some of them even lost their lives delivering this footage.
No one that worked on the documentary was killed. I'm very thankful to say. However, Hussein, who was the producer in the north, in December, his four-year-old daughter Salma was killed by ground troops. She was shot by ground troops right in front of Hussein.
Now, of the three families profiled in this documentary, probably the most well known of them will be Hind Rajab's family, because her name has become something of a global rallying cry. I watched your film today, and as soon as I got done watching it, I went on social media and I saw this exchange, which took place today, between State's Department spokesperson Matthew Miller and a journalist, and it references directly the forensic investigation of this killing that you reference in the movie. And I would just like to play this for you and get both of your thoughts.
A UK-based research group concluded Israeli tank likely killed 6-year-old Palestinian child Hind Rajab. Investigation revealed that Rajab's car was hit with 355 bullets, and it's not plausible that Israeli tank couldn't see children inside the car. Have you seen the reports, and do you have any updates on the investigation? It's been more than 4 months, and a lot of my colleagues have been asking about that.
So we have seen the reports, and I will tell you what our latest interaction with the government of Israel is about this. So we went to the government of Israel and pressed them for information, and they told us that there were no IDF tanks operating in the area, no IDF forces operating in the area at the time of that attack, which I believe is something they've also said publicly. After further reporting, we went back to them and pressed them again. And so what they told us is that they went to the UN organizations, they went to the Palestinian Red Crescent, they asked for information, because you've seen all of those organizations quoted in stories. They asked for information that they could use to further an investigation, and no one provided them with any information. That's the latest that we have on the
So
case.
who shot the 355 tank bullets?
I'm not able to, look, I'm not on the ground. I can't offer any kind of assessment about this. That's why we've called for the government of Israel to conduct an investigation. I can't speak to what their internal processes look like. All I can tell you is what they've told us, and what they've said is they went to the UN and the Palestinian Red Crescent and asked them to supply information that would help them. And what they claim is that they were given none.
But it's not concluded yet, the investigation, or is it?
No, I would refer you to the government of Israel for that. I can only tell you what they have told us.
Okay. Sharif, what I mean, in light of this documentary, what do you make of the Israeli claim given voice by the U.S. State Department that there were, quote, no tanks in the area?
I can say with a lot of confidence that this is a lie. We have different kinds of evidence to belie that claim. Firstly, there's satellite imagery taken that day that shows Israeli tanks up the road from where the car that Hind was in with her relatives was parked at the gas station. There's a satellite image that shows the tanks. Secondly, we have 2 recordings of Leanne, 15 years old, telling the Red Crescent that there's a tank right next to her and it's shooting, and then you hear the shooting. And thirdly, you hear Hind, also 6-year-old, saying there's a tank right next to the car. So that's also testimony, that is evidence. And finally, through the analysis that we worked with forensic architecture and earshot, they analyzed the phone call with Leanne, where you hear 64 gunshots. Those gunshots are all similar in characteristics, similar in loudness, and they happen at a speed of about 900 rounds per minute, which is in excess of what an AK-47 rifle could fire, and is consistent with the machine gun that's mounted on a Merkava tank. So all of this evidence belies these claims, and Matt Miller and the State Department have been asked about this investigation, so-called investigation by the Israeli government, time and time again, ever since Hind was killed at the end of January, and clearly nothing's happening. These Israeli investigations are used as a smokescreen to delay any accountability forever, basically, to the extent that the leading human rights group in Israel, B'Tselem, has refused to cooperate with the Israeli military on any investigations because they're basically what's been called a legal iron dome. They just say they're investigating, but they don't actually investigate. And there's very rarely, hardly ever, any accountability.
I don't know if you caught it there, but Miller almost said we're supporting an independent investigation before catching himself. But the killing of Hind and her cousin is but merely like one facet of this atrocity. Could you talk about the Palestinian Red Crescent? And now the thing is, this is the most well-known atrocity in this documentary, certainly the one I was aware of. But to our listeners, you do not really understand what happened here until you listen to what are essentially the 911 calls to the Palestinian Red Crescent. Could you render for our listeners what happened and who they were talking to on the phone and what happened when help was dispatched?
Sure. So in a nutshell, basically, I mean, the story of this family is actually quite common in Gaza, unfortunately. Wissam Hamada, who's Hind's mother, fled her home in Gaza City in the north on orders from the Israeli military to go south. They went south. The south continued to be bombed. So they made the decision to go back north. They go back north. They, again, can't find safety there. There's very heavy bombing on January 28th in the evening in the neighborhood of where they were seeking shelter. They decide the next day they have to leave. So Wissam's uncle, Bashar, leaves with his wife and children, including Hind, 6-year-old Hind, and his own daughter, 15-year-old Layan. They get in a car, and the idea was he was going to go take them to another area, come back, get Hind's mother, and leave. As soon as they leave, like 2 blocks away, Hind's mother hears shooting. They hear people calling for an ambulance. So Hind's mother flees on foot. She immediately starts calling her uncle, who was driving the car. No one picks up. Finally, his daughter picks up, 15-year-old Layan. She says, everyone in the car is dead except for me and Hind. We've both been shot. We're bleeding. And everyone else is dead. So Hind's mother then and the family start calling the Red Crescent in Ramallah to try and find a way to get them rescued in Gaza, for the Red Crescent dispatchers in Gaza. So the Red Crescent in Ramallah finally calls that same number. Layan picks up. And Layan says, the tank is right next to us. She's screaming, saying the tank is right next to us. And then you hear 64 shots in quick succession and Layan screaming. And Layan essentially is killed. The line cuts. They call back. The Red Crescent calls back. It rings. Who picks up this time? Hind, 6 years old. They ask her, where was the girl we were just talking to? She said she's dead. So you have the 6-year-old girl now on the phone, surrounded by her dead relatives, in a car. She says, there's a tank right next to me. Please come rescue me. In Gaza, the Red Crescent and emergency workers have to seek approval from the Israeli military, and they coordinate this through the Red Cross, which then coordinates through Kogat, which is the wing of the Israeli military that deals with the occupied territories, to get approval. It takes 3 hours for the Israeli military to finally grant approval. And during this time, the emergency workers are on the phone with Hind. They have this entire recording, speaking with her. She's scared. She's injured. She's bleeding. She continually asks for help. She says, please come rescue me. The Israeli military sends a map with an approved route that the Red Crescent provided to us and that we show in the film for the ambulance workers to go. They're then immediately dispatched. We have the recording of the Red Crescent in Ramallah speaking to the drivers as they're going. He said, are you working? Is your siren on? Are your lights on? He says, the lights are on, but my siren isn't on. And then you hear a loud bang. And what that was essentially was they got hit with a direct hit from a tank shell. So despite getting approval from the Israeli military, and after 3 hours, they go to the area and they're hit. And it wasn't until 12 days later, when the Israeli forces withdrew from the area, that civil defense workers could go in, that they found out. They confirmed what everyone had suspected. Hind had died. And Hind, by the way, was on the phone during this whole time. Her voice continually gets fainter and fainter. Her last words were, she said, I'm bleeding from my mouth. So they told her, okay, just use your dress and wipe your mouth with the sleeve of your dress. And she says, I don't want to upset my mother and get the dress dirty. They had patched her mother in. Her mother says, don't worry, my love. Just do that and I will clean the dress for you. And that was the last we ever heard of Hind. And when they arrived 12 days later, they found the entire family dead. They found just a few dozen meters away, the ambulance completely destroyed in what looked like a direct hit. And we do an investigation with forensic architecture that shows the entry and exit of the munition. And, this case reverberated around the world because we have this recording of Hind that was then broadcast. And she became an icon of both Palestinian suffering and Palestinian resilience.
Sharif, yeah, the moment you talk about at the end of the call where she says she doesn't want to get her dress dirty absolutely destroyed me. And just like speaking personally, I don't have kids, but I can, for anyone who does, especially small children, watching this documentary will be almost unbearable. And it's made even more so by the fact that this is a daily reality for like 2 million people in Gaza right now. And then speaking of the Red Crescent ambulance, I mean, like just the sentence alone, the ambulance was hit with an anti-tank shell should tell you everything. These are munitions that are used to fight armor in a war that's being used to obliterate an ambulance. And then your colleagues in Gaza have, footage of the gas station where this occurred. The remnants of the ambulance is still there, as are the spent rounds on the floor. And the Hind's case is the most well-known one, but like the thing about this movie is in the 3 cases that you examine, these are really each of them stand-ins for so many other stories in Gaza. These are just but a keyhole glimpse. Could you talk about how each one of these stories, Sharif, sort of explicates a different horror or aspect of this war and the American hypocrisy and lies to justify it? Like, for instance, how about could we talk a little bit about the Salem family?
Yeah, the Salem family undergo 2 massacres, actually, and they feature in the beginning and the end of the film. So early on in the war, their neighborhood in Gaza City was bombed and they were forced to flee their home to search for safety. Again, this is a very typical story for so many hundreds of thousands in Gaza. They went to stay with relatives in a building not too far from their home. On the morning of December 11th, a massive airstrike hits their building. Over 100 people are killed. Nearly all of them are from their family, their extended family. We worked with a nonprofit group, Air Wars, who investigated the strike and documented as close as possible all the names of the people who were killed in that strike. They estimate about 50 children were killed in that strike alone. And so this is, a pattern of wiping out families across generations. So that's an airstrike. And that has, been many human rights groups and the UN as well has said the level of bombing, 6,000 munitions in the first week alone. And that there hasn't been this type of bombing campaign since World War II, essentially, and has been such a feature of this war. This family, the survivors, Heba Selim and her children, they moved to another building after this strike. And by then, Israeli troops have moved into the north and encircled it. The family ends up trapped inside a building with Israeli tanks and troops outside who are attacking the building, shelling and shooting at it for a few days. There's no one firing back. It's clear it's civilians inside. On the afternoon of December 19th, the Israeli troops enter the building, storm several apartments. They separate the men from the women. They beat and abuse the men and boys. They strip search the women and verbally abuse them and beat them as well. And then they strip the men down to their underwear, make them lie face down on the floor, and summarily execute them. At least 11 men were executed, according to multiple eyewitnesses. The soldiers then left, but continued attacking the building with what eyewitnesses describe as shelling and shooting from a quadcopter. Heba Selim's 4-year-old daughter, Nada, is hit in the eye. She's also killed. And we can talk about how we verified all of this, but this incident is specifically cited in South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice to institute proceedings against Israel, accusing it of acts of genocide. So just in this family alone, we examine both airstrikes and arbitrary executions. And the theme throughout the film is about the search for safety and the possibility of it, and U.S. complicity. You have the Al-Ghaf family, which we've talked about. They fled from the north to Khan Yunis, to so-called safe zone, only to be bombed there by the Israeli military anyway. Now, that scene, the father, Abdullah Al-Ghaf, his youngest son, 2-year-old Firas, asks him to get biscuits with dates that he likes. So his father goes to the market, and that's when the Israeli military attacks the building where they're staying. Abdullah's wife, Marihan, is killed, and his 2-year-old Firas is killed. The video of him coming back and putting the biscuit in the hand of his dead 2-year-old son, who's covered in a shroud, and he's sobbing and saying, his son didn't even have a mouth.
The line that, again, another just absolutely gut-wrenching moment is when the father says, imagine giving your son a biscuit and knowing that your son doesn't even have a mouth.
And this video at the time, as so much of this is live streamed, it did go viral. But what most people don't know is that not only was Abdullah's son killed, his 2-year-old Firas, his cousin's 3-year-old son Farid was also killed. But Abdullah's other son, 8-year-old Muhammad, was badly injured. And this shows another aspect of the war, the lack of medical attention and the complete attack on the healthcare system in Gaza. So the hospitals at this time, and this is in December, they're barely functioning because of the Israeli assault and blockade, and going into the new year in January. And Muhammad can't get the care he needs. He suffers, this child, 8-year-old child, for 25 days without proper medicine, without proper painkillers. They finally get permission for him to be evacuated to Egypt for medical attention. Another aspect of this war, that people are trapped. Even if they want to leave Gaza, it's very, very difficult to leave. But it's too late. And you see Abdullah saying this tearful goodbye to his 8-year-old son, who's begging him to come with him. And he says, I can't come, but I'll try and meet you there. He's transferred to Egypt, and he dies the next day because of his injuries. Abdullah ends up moving with his surviving children, his 2 daughters, Wadad and Nagham, to a tent in Rafah. This is where we met with them. And now, but we're not sure, but I very much doubt they're still in Rafah. 1 million people have fled Rafah since Israel invaded in May. And most likely they're back somewhere in Khan Yunis or Dir al-Balah. So the story of continual displacement, of forcible displacement, and the impossible search for safety is another feature of what we investigate.
Kavitha, I want to ask you, speaking with Sharif just relayed, and the survivors of these massacres that are interviewed, who say what has happened to them or a loved one, whether it's Hind's mother or the young man who survived the summary execution in that apartment block, who survived because he got hit in the arm a few times and he just went unconscious. So presumably he was able to appear dead. When you receive this kind of testimony, both as a journalist, as a filmmaker, what do you how do you feel, or how do you approach these stories in terms of giving voice to the unspeakable? Is this a difficulty for you as a filmmaker, or how do you use this kind of testimony when you edit together or make this film?
I mean, I think the main thing that we always want to do, the hardest thing, honestly, is not including everything, right? Hind's mother, Wassam, she said so many things. I wish we could just put her whole interview out there. Maybe we will, to be honest, because there's so many poignant and heartbreaking things she said. So actually, the hardest thing is not including everything. That's actually always the hardest part. It's kind of starting from the point. I always try to start from the point of, all right, what are the kind of cold, hard facts of a case? We put those in, and then we find, then we start layering it with different, other aspects of the story. And, usually also, I think one of the most important things that we try to do is also, include things about the family members they lost, who they were, right? So Wassam talks about how Leanne wanted to be a surgeon and Hind wanted to be a dentist, and they said we'll have a clinic together. These small things, so that they're not just that people know them because they were killed, but they had a life, and they should have had a longer life than they did. So we wanted to include pieces of that. Or in the case of the executions, Yahya, he lost 10 members of his family, including his brother. and so we, wanted to make sure at the end of that, that the viewer has to see photos of every single person that was killed, so that they aren't just, a number, right? So I think that's kind of, the way that, our approach.
And just to give just a quick thing on Yahya, if I may.
Yes, please.
You see, I translated part of his interview, and you see this is included in the film when he's talking about how this was the worst day of his life, and he's describing it. At the end, he puts his hand up towards the camera as if to stop filming, grabs his stomach, and then it doubles over and puts his hands on his knees. That there's a physical reaction of him just recounting watching his family be executed in front of him. It floored me, to be honest. The first time I watched it, it's even hard to talk about it now.
I was going to say, Kavitha, I mean, I opened the conversation talking about, like the difficulty or challenge in breaking this story out of cell phones, of real life, like even if how powerful these images and videos are. But another interesting thing this documentary does is that the cell phone and the images and recordings of these people and their lives are seen through your lens, through the lens of the cameras of the filmmakers in Gaza, standing not as a testament to their death, but now still the only, like one of the last remaining testimonies to their life. And I don't do you have any feelings like the mix of the two different screens on which we are seeing both the life and death of the people that the subjects that you're rendering their story?
I mean, I guess, it's interesting. At the first image you see is one of a video of Hiba's, of her children playing in the ocean, and with all of the families, there are moments, where they're looking at their cell phones of the children that they've lost, and in Hiba's case, her husband who was killed, and it's. I mean, one of the things I know that the families they talked about, that they don't actually have a lot of their photos anymore, or what they have left is on their phone, because when they had to leave their home behind, and so all of their memories have been stolen, taken, destroyed, and so their phones there's just so, they contain so much of their lives just right there. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's one of those, I don't want to say smaller, but you don't think about it as much in the face of, entire families being annihilated and targeted, and people seeking refuge, hit with precision munitions and tanks. But it's just one of those smaller things that, a lot of us over here, thankfully, will probably never have to think about. The idea of all of this happening to you, and then just all documentation of your life and all traces of normalcy, and just your relationships before all this just evaporating in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, O'Day, Hiba's son, he says something at the very beginning of the film where he talks about how they had a routine. It was just, a normal life. Their dad would go to work. He would come home and help, him and his mom his parents would make dinner together. And it's, all of that's gone now. They don't have that. When she talked about, how the sea was her favorite place and how it was peaceful, they don't have that anymore, right? I mean, it's just these different layers of the things that we take for granted. One of the reasons we asked the crew in Gaza, for each of the families, to ask them about what night meant to them, because, night is supposed to be the time when we sleep and have peace and can rest, and when children should be able to just dream, and that's gone, right? They'll never have that. Like, imagine trying to sleep and it's just a constant drone or airstrikes all the time. So yeah, it's just these different pieces of life that are just completely have been stolen.
It reminded me of, another horrible instance of, America's imperial wars, but there was a similar thing that happened with children in Pakistan who, after the drone campaigns of the late 2000s and early 2010s, they grew to be just terrified of clear skies and would be happy every time it was overcast, because that meant there was less of a chance of like an MQ-9 flying overhead and killing someone they knew or destroying some place that they used to go to. It's just obviously like you want as many people to survive as possible in, whether it's a war, just an outright genocide like this. But I feel like it gets overlooked just what that actually means to survive this, what your life is after that, how different everything is, and how much is taken from you.
Going off that, Sharif, I'd like to return to something you said, where it was like basically the thread that connects this movie is the impossibility of survival in Gaza. And one element about that I think really brings into focus the like absurdity and cruelty of America and Israel's policy is this idea of safe zones. And you've already talked a little bit about like the use of these safe zones, but I want to talk about one clip in the film where you show a clip of John Kirby talking at a press conference, and he is using the example of these safe zones, and he has this like grin on his face when he does like this rictus grin on his face as he says it, and he goes, "It's like telegraphing your punches. I don't know of any modern army in the world that would do that. I mean, we wouldn't even do that." And like, I was struck by a certain thing because like watching this film, it's very hard to conclude that the purpose of these safe zones is anything other than to like concentrate people into an area that they're going to be in and then kill them. And like, I don't know, maybe the US actually hasn't done anything like that, at least that I can think of. But like, how is the example of like safe zones and how they're used as a cudgel to sort of shield from the public, the true face of what's happening here?
Well, this is a long-standing Israeli talking point in the military. If you look at previous wars on Gaza in 2014, in 2012, in 2008 and 9, they always say that, and this is where they're aligned the most moral army in the world, that they issue warnings before they attack. They would sometimes fire a missile without a warhead on a building, which is called a knock on the roof. That indicates to the family inside that they have a few minutes to evacuate before they destroy the building. But this is all, at the end of the day, they kill massive numbers of civilians. And either they have precision targeting and they're intending to kill massive numbers of civilians, or they don't have precision targeting and they're firing on one of the most densely populated places on Earth and are just killing civilians. What we do know from reporting from 972 and elsewhere is that they're relying on an AI algorithm for targeting purposes, and they're willing to fire on a building and kill 100 people to get a single low-level Hamas commander, if that. Most of the time, they just hit civilians anyway. And as we've seen in this war on Gaza, they are firing in these safe zones repeatedly. We did an interview with Air Wars who document this. But just even recently, they keep telling people to go to Mawasi. And in the beginning, most Palestinians in Gaza did not want to go to Mawasi. This is just sand. It's an area that is just a sandy beach. There's nothing. There's no water. There's no infrastructure there. But a lot of them did end up going there. They've bombed it several times. It's just tents on a beach, and they've bombed it. The so-called red line of Rafah, with the Biden administration repeatedly saying, you need a so-called plan to protect civilians before invading Rafah. We've seen a massive invasion of Rafah. The Israelis have gone in, and they're completely destroying it now in this systematic way. There is, when we're talking about memories and going back and what's left, there is nothing left in Gaza. They've destroyed Gaza City. They've destroyed Khan Yunis. They're destroying Rafah. I think Dir al-Balah is maybe the only place that is somewhat still intact, but it's become uninhabitable completely. And this is systemic. This is intentional. I have no idea what the future will hold for Palestinians in Gaza.
Another major element of this film is examining what currently stands for like the edifice of international law. And you mentioned earlier that like we have not seen bombing campaigns like this since World War II. And like sort of the idea was that out of the horrors of World War II, that something called international law was created to prevent the wholesale massacre of civilians that happened from air, on land, whatever, in World War II from ever happening again. You talk to representatives of groups like Amnesty International, who are supposed to represent international law. And what we're seeing, and what we've all been seeing for the past 8 months, and what your film puts a very fine point on, is that not only is the United States willing to ignore all of it, but we are actively trashing. We're actively getting rid of all of this, and I just like to return to the idea that like international law and international humanitarian law and the prevention of war crimes is really like what the United States holds for itself as the reason that we are like the moral leaders of the world, the reason that it justifies being an empire, a global superpower. It's what makes us different from all the other countries of the world. What did you find, like speaking to like former members of the U.S. government or that woman from Amnesty International, about like the state of international law and what the United States is doing to even the idea of such right now?
Well, one of my, I think, favorite sound bites, and because I think it gets to it, is from Akbar from HuffPost, and he says that it's hard to overstate the extent to which international law gets thrown out the window in Washington, and he's right. It's the U.S., the administration is, according to Biden's own conventional arms transfer policy, is supposed to ensure that U.S. weapons that are sent to other governments are used in accordance with international law. They haven't been doing that, and this was on the quote unquote cutting room floor, I guess, but Josh Paul, the former State Department official who resigned 10 days into the war, he said one of the things he brought up is that you don't ask the questions when you already know you don't want the answer. And so, yeah, they're just like not asking the questions because they know there is no way that you can look at what's been happening in Gaza and say that international law hasn't been broken. It's just a question of if they care. And I think the reality is that they don't, right? And no one's going to stop them. That's the other part of it. Josh Paul actually says that they know that they will never be held accountable, right? So it's disgusting, to say the least.
And I would just add briefly that I think we all understand that international law wasn't some perfect system beforehand that protected against war crimes and people were held to account. This was always a system that protected the powerful, and that was very, very problematic. I mean, and especially since 9/11 has been chipped away increasingly, especially by the United States. You had Guantanamo, you had invasions, you had torture, you had rendition, all of these things. No one from the US was being hauled before any international court. But I think what's different this time, and there was at least this a kind of system that you could work within. Even if we knew it was a broken system, you could push in different ways and pressure, and there was at least the rhetoric of some sort of international order, and some things would be held to account, and it did hold possibly the very worst, which is genocide, at bay. And what the head of Amnesty International says, and what others say, is that, yeah, we've essentially, the gloves have been off for a long time, but now the mask is off. And that they are completely just shredding any semblance of international law. What does a group like Amnesty International do now when the most powerful countries in the world, the United States and Europe, are actively backing and apologizing for this brutality? That now anyone can say anything, and no one, I mean, the system is completely kind of in shreds right now. And maybe that's what it always was, and it's just being laid bare. But it is. We are in some kind of new phase, I think.
Kavitha, you talked about a sort of a culture of impunity in Washington because they know that like no matter what they do, like they're not going to be at the dock at the ICC, probably not. That they know that this is all just words. But I want to talk about something that the former State Department official Josh Paul mentioned. He mentioned it in passing. It's not really delved into in the documentary, but like there is also like this also inculcates a culture of total impunity in Israel itself. And one of the things he mentions as evidence of that is Israeli soldiers posting on TikTok gleeful advertisements of their own war crimes. Like Sharif, like have you must have encountered this kind of thing before, but what do we make of a genocide that's unfolding, that's probably one of the most documented in history as it's happening, but it's being documented by the people doing it who are showing the world, for instance, the trophies they've won in battle of women's underwear or a wheelchair or children's toys.
I think it's a clear indication that they're acting with a very confident sense of impunity, that they will not be held accountable for these actions. By some accounts, in 972 and Haaretz have reported on this, that their commanders actually actively tell them that it's okay to do these things. The Israeli military has claimed at times that they've held a couple of soldiers to account, and there's been some sort of recriminations. But it's clear that there's going to be no justice for this, and so they're very proudly showing off dynamiting universities and burning down hospitals and raiding homes and flaunting women's underwear and these kinds of things. Just the most absurdly grotesque war crimes that in the past had to be exposed and this time are just being broadcast openly. And so it just speaks to, the sense of impunity that they have, and for good reason. They're backed by the most powerful countries in the world, and no one is going to hold them accountable for these actions.
You also speak in the movie to Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen, who has, made statements about, hey, we need to follow the Leahy law. Could you explain a little bit about not just international law, but how we're trashing U.S.'s own domestic law as it regards the export of weapons to foreign militaries? And what do you make of Leahy's statements with regards to that the U.S. should follow our own laws?
Well, so the Leahy law, it was it's named after, it was proposed by former Senator Patrick Leahy. The whole idea behind it is that the U.S., before they send any kind of assistance to a foreign military, they need to vet that unit and make sure that there aren't any credible allegations of gross violations of human rights. But the thing is that for Israel as well as Ukraine and Egypt, these three countries, that's not they have a different system when it comes to the Leahy law. Instead of doing that, they will give the assistance first, and then, as Josh Paul puts it, keep an eye out or an ear out to see if they hear anything. But in the case of Israel, it's never been enforced. And Patrick Leahy himself has actually said this. He started to talk about it towards the end of his time in the Senate, which was, I believe, the end of 2022. But even, it was only because he was retiring. I don't think he would have ever said that before, because you are not supposed to criticize Israel in Washington. This is like a well-known fact. And if you do, you will suffer politically. But he even started to bring it up towards the end of his time. Actually, it was specifically in relation to the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. But, when you don't enforce, when your top arms supplier is not enforcing the law, they're and saying, okay, yeah, you did do these horrible things. You have killed people. You have raped children. But we are actually going to continue giving you weapons and aid. When you've got that level of impunity, you have completely just said, to hell with human rights.
Sharif, I want to return to the executions of the families in that apartment complex, because I picked up on something that one of the survivors said when he was recounting what happened to them. And he said that the soldiers who were abusing and eventually executing them were speaking in both Hebrew and some were speaking in English. And I guess that just made me wonder, do we have any evidence that any of the soldiers responsible or in these specific massacres are U.S. passport holders or potentially even active duty in the U.S. military?
We don't have any evidence of that. It's very hard to verify something like that. We do know that Israeli soldiers, we can say with a very high degree of confidence that they executed these 11 people in this way. And we do know that U.S. Citizens have joined the Israeli military and have been deployed in Gaza. But no, we don't have any direct evidence to tie them to this execution.
So I'd like to turn now to the media. And this documentary has now been out. It's available on YouTube now for anyone who wants to watch it. We will have a link in the show description. But have either of you? I mean, has any of the work that you've done in this film? Have you seen any pickup from the American media? Any mention? I mean, I was an example of that question asked at the Matthew Miller press conference today. But like, have you received any pickup from the American media?
Kavitha, do you know?
Not that I don't think so. I don't think so. I would be quite shocked if any mainstream U.S. media did pick it up.
Yeah. I mean, and once again, I mean, you mentioned that more journalists have been killed in Gaza than in any other conflict in decades. And it just like, it really, I mean, I guess I don't even have a question here, but I just think it really brings into sharp focus all of the stated reasons that our media loves to advertise about itself, which is specific, like basically to stop something like this from ever happening. And the complete refusal to acknowledge their own colleagues being massacred by the Israeli military with the full support of the U.S. government really, I mean, it really puts into stark relief just what the U.S. media is. And I guess I'm wondering, like, throughout your career, is like, I mean, how do you see the role of Western journalism as being like just as complicit as the U.S. government in what is happening in Gaza right now?
I was just going to say that on Palestine, legacy corporate media in this country has long been an enabler of Israeli occupation, of Israeli apartheid, and now an enabler of Israeli genocide. The coverage from major outlets, especially in the first few months, was atrocious. And I'm not even talking on the level of, if we can forget politics, we can forget how we think about settler colonialism, we can forget how we think about Zionism, all of these things. I'm talking on a pure level of just pure journalism. The rhetorical acrobatics that these papers had to go through to avoid saying something like Israel bombs refugee camp in Gaza. The headline would be explosion, Gazans say kills many in neighborhood. Something like that. So that's one thing. And the other point is that, yes, I think it's shameful. The lack of acknowledgement of these journalists being killed in Gaza. So many journalists in this country have spoken out, have put on their Twitter or their social media profiles photos of Evan Gershkovich, and rightly so. He should be freed. He's unjustly imprisoned. He's a political prisoner in Russia. But when you have a record number, as many as 150 Palestinian journalists in Gaza being killed, and all these award shows speaking to the courage of the media and so forth, and not mentioning these journalists, it is an utter failure. And the journalists who have survived, as we've discussed, have lost so much. Almost all of them have lost some family member. They've lost their homes. They're hungry. They're displaced. And there's just no coverage of this. I mean, CPJ even recently said that they're still trying to verify the deaths of 4 journalists in Shifa Hospital. So this is another thing. They destroyed the largest hospital in Palestine. It was accounted for 30% of all medical care in Gaza alone in April. And when the Israelis finally withdrew, we have stories of mass graves, hundreds of bodies being found outside, arbitrary executions, doctors being tortured. This did not get a lick of coverage that it should have. It got some coverage, but not what it deserved. And part of the problem that CPJ is, they're still trying to verify the killings of 4 journalists at Shifa, is because so many journalists have been killed and they don't have enough people on the ground to verify information. So you have this terrible cycle. They keep killing journalists, and so there's less information coming out, and the cycle continues. And it's not being, the fact that it's not being covered properly in this country by large media outlets is enabling it to happen and continue to happen.
One thing that I've always found particularly, well, not shocking, but telling with Western journalism and coverage of Israel is just the extent to which they allow conflicts of interest that they just would not allow anywhere else. Like, I mean, the contemporary example everyone always uses now is Barak Ravid, the Axios reporter, who's, you know, if I don't believe he's still in, but was very recently in the IDF reserve. But before that, there was the New York Times bureau chief for, I think, all of Israel, Judy Reardon, where they were either in the IDF or they were, members of their families were settlers or they were settlers. It was just a total lack of propriety that they would, with anything else, they would pride themselves on stamping out. This was in 2021, but I don't know if you recall that the woman who was fired from the AP for belonging to SJP in college. Compare and contrast that to probably the dozens, if not hundreds, of people bureau chiefs and reporters who have been members of Hillel or similar organizations.
I mean, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that, like all these rules are there because we're journalism to seek out, engage with, or even be allowed into Gaza. We simply could not countenance what they would have to say. So they don't get to say it. And like, Felix, you're exactly right. Like, someone with even like a Middle Eastern sounding last name gets spiked off of stories because of some appearance of impropriety. And then like, many people at the New York Times, like either have family members who are active duty in the IDF or are living in homes that were seized from Palestinians in East Jerusalem in 1948.
Yeah.
Ugh. Sharif, Kavitha, I don't really have any more questions for you. I just want to say, thank you for your work here. It is a devastating, but also very meticulous construction of what represents a keyhole glimpse into like the horrors going on right now, unabated, with the full support of the U.S. government. As professionals, like I know it must seem hopeless sometimes, but like it is very clear that you still like the importance and necessity of a documentary work like this. It comes through in your work, and I really thank you both for just assembling this really essential piece of journalism.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I guess we will leave it there for today.